Tendai and Zuri wandered the town in silence, each step taking them deeper into shared memories. It was strange, this dance of familiarity and distance between them. The streets were unchanged, the same uneven cobblestones, the same shops tucked between their weathered brick facades. Zuri walked beside him with a quiet hesitation, her gaze flitting over the familiar sights, like she was looking at a ghost of herself, scattered across the places that had once held their laughter, arguments, and shared dreams. The first stop on this unplanned journey was the old bookstore on the corner. The windows, fogged from years of humidity and dust, still displayed the same faded posters and second-hand books that they had once browsed together on countless afternoons. Zuri slowed as they passed, her steps faltering for a moment. Tendai felt the familiar pang of nostalgia, watching her eyes trace the outline of the shelves inside. He remembered how she would lose herself in those shelves, her fingers dancing over the spines, lost in worlds he couldn't enter. There was a sadness in her gaze now, a kind of wistful ache that made him feel as if she were longing for more than just the books she'd once loved. They continued walking, leaving the bookstore behind, the silence thick but companionable. He stole glances at her as they made their way through the streets, her face touched by a kind of sorrow that mirrored his own. They passed the coffee stand where they'd once shared countless early mornings, huddled together with steaming cups, watching the world slowly wake up around them. Tendai could almost feel the warmth of her laughter, the softness in her eyes when she would tease him about his coffee addiction, or the way she'd wrinkle her nose at the bitterness but sip anyway, just to be close to him. Now it was a quiet space, empty of customers, the familiar barista inside barely sparing them a glance as they passed by. As they walked, the weight of the years stretched between them, filled with all the words left unsaid. Tendai tried to focus on the present, on the sound of their footsteps against the cobblestones, but his mind kept slipping back to other days. Memories rose unbidden, each one sharper than the last. He remembered a summer day when they'd taken refuge from the heat in a little gelato shop down the alley. It had been a relief from the oppressive sun, a small retreat in the cool darkness, the sweetness of shared spoons and stolen kisses. Zuri had laughed then, carefree and unguarded, as she leaned into him, her cheeks flushed from the chill of the gelato and the warmth of his touch. Now the alley seemed darker, narrower, the shop shuttered, as if time itself had moved on from those happy moments. They drifted towards the old art gallery next, the one where they'd once spent entire afternoons, pointing out paintings and pretending to decipher their meanings. It was closed now, its windows dusty, with signs of neglect creeping over its faded walls. Tendai remembered Zuri's fascination with the abstract art, her eyes lighting up as she explained her interpretations with such conviction, making him feel as though he was seeing the colors and brushstrokes through her eyes. He'd only pretended to care about the art, his attention drawn instead to the quiet beauty in her expressions, the way her fingers would hover in the air as she tried to capture the images she saw in her mind. The gallery was a relic now, like so much of their shared past, once bright and alive, now a shadowed reminder of things left behind. Their path led them through the quieter parts of town, to the gardens where they had once walked hand in hand, dreaming of a future neither of them fully understood. The flowers were in bloom, filling the air with a fragrance that was both intoxicating and bittersweet. Tendai felt the memories surge up, sharp and painful. He could almost see them, younger versions of themselves, laughing as they wove through the garden, stopping to admire the roses that Zuri had loved so much. She had once told him that roses were proof that beauty and thorns could coexist, and he'd teased her for her dramatics. But now he saw the truth in her words, the way beauty and pain were intertwined, like petals and thorns, like love and loss. They reached the old stone bridge that arched over the narrow river at the edge of town. The water below was calm, mirroring the sky, the trees on either side casting shadows that danced in the gentle current. It had been here, on this very bridge, that he had first confessed his love for her. The memory was as vivid as if it had just happened, his heart pounding, the words slipping out in a rush, her startled laughter, and then her quiet "I love you too," spoken with a sincerity that had both terrified and completed him. They had stood here for what felt like hours afterward, watching the river flow by, feeling as if time itself had paused to witness their shared vow. Now the bridge felt cold, the weight of their past love heavy in the silence that stretched between them. The sun was beginning to set as they neared the small chapel at the edge of town, its stained glass windows catching the fading light. It had been one of Zuri's favorite places, a sanctuary of quiet and peace, even though neither of them was particularly religious. She would sit in the pews, her eyes closed, breathing in the stillness, as if she could find solace in the silence. Tendai would watch her, feeling a deep, unexplainable longing to protect her, even from the things he couldn't see. Standing outside the chapel now, he felt that same longing again, stronger than ever, mixed with a fierce regret for all the moments they had lost. They lingered by the chapel for a long moment, neither of them speaking. He could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them, a vast ocean of words and emotions stretching into the distance. As the light faded, they began to walk back, the familiar path taking on a new significance. It was as if each step carried them deeper into a shared silence, one that held both the pain of their separation and the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. By the time they returned to the starting point of their walk, Tendai felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a peace born of resolution, but rather a quiet acceptance of all they had been through, of all the scars they had collected along the way. He glanced at Zuri, her face softened by the dim light, and saw in her eyes a reflection of his own journey, a mixture of sorrow, regret, and the faintest glimmer of hope. In that moment he realized that this walk had not only been a journey through their shared memories, but also a way of coming to terms with the shadows that lingered between them. It was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that their past would always be a part of them, but that they could choose how to carry it forward. Tendai and Zuri reached the park just as the early afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long, dappled shadows over the grassy expanse. The place was nearly deserted, the usual buzz of families and children replaced by an unusual quiet that settled over the grounds like a gentle veil. Tendai led them down a winding path to a more secluded area, where the willow trees grew close, their branches drooping low enough to offer a sense of privacy. Here, shielded by the soft whisper of leaves in the breeze, Zuri seemed to let her shoulders relax, if only slightly. They took a seat on a worn wooden bench, positioned to overlook a small pond. Tendai's gaze drifted across the water, watching how it reflected the surrounding trees, the reflections broken only by the occasional ripple from a dragonfly or falling leaf. There was a strange beauty in this small oasis, a fragile sense of peace that belied the weight they both carried. He could sense her beside him, tense and guarded, and although he longed to reach out, to give her the reassurance he knew she needed, he held back, letting her come to her own resolve in her own time. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. They had always shared a way of communicating without words, and now it felt even more poignant, as if language could only break the spell cast by their unspoken connection. As the minutes ticked by, he noticed Zuri's gaze fixed on the water, her expression far away, as though she was seeing something just beyond the surface. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a heaviness that had not been there before. It was as if this park, their shared sanctuary in times past, had peeled away her armor, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. Tendai sat quietly, waiting, sensing that she was gathering herself, mustering the courage to peel back the layers of her past. He felt a pang of empathy as he watched her, recognizing in her face the silent battle she fought to reconcile who she had been with the person she had become. He could almost feel her memories pressing in around them, like the echo of shadows from another world, a world he had only glimpsed through fragments of her hesitant confessions. After a while, Zuri exhaled slowly, her fingers absently tracing patterns along the edge of the bench. He noticed her hands, the way they trembled slightly, as if they were struggling to let go of a weight too long carried alone. There was an elegance to her silence, a resilience woven into the pauses, and he knew that whatever she held inside was vast and consuming. She glanced up at the willow branches, watching as the wind moved through them, their leaves whispering a sound like secrets in the breeze. Her face softened as she watched them, and he wondered if she saw herself in those branches, fragile, bending but unbroken, holding fast despite the storms that had swept through her life. For a brief moment he caught a glimpse of the girl he had fallen in love with years ago, a girl who had once been as free as the wind, her laughter bright and unguarded, but that girl was now hidden beneath layers of pain and loss, shadows of a life he could barely comprehend. Eventually she looked back at the pond, her gaze intense yet hollow, as if staring down into her own past. Tendai remained silent, sensing that this was her battle to face, her story to tell. He could feel her memories gathering like a storm, ready to break free from the chains she had wrapped around them. Zuri's fingers stilled, and her shoulders seemed to sink slightly, as if surrendering to the weight of what she was about to unveil. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, her words more for herself than for him. Tendai listened, his gaze fixed on the pond, but every word was a knife that cut through the stillness around them, leaving invisible scars on the afternoon's peace. She spoke of Malik in halting fragments, weaving together images of a man who had once been charming, magnetic, and intense. She described the allure of his charisma, the way he had pulled her into a world that was intoxicating and mysterious, and how she had been drawn to him, believing herself to be a part of something greater, something dangerous and thrilling. Tendai felt a chill as he realized how vulnerable she must have been, how easily Malik had molded her perception of reality, like clay in his hands. As she spoke, Tendai noticed the gradual change in her tone, the bitterness that seeped in, the quiet fury that laced her voice when she recounted Malik's gradual transformation. The man she had thought she knew had been nothing more than an illusion, a mask worn by someone cruel, someone whose influence spread far beyond her life. Malik, she revealed, had drawn her into a dark world, surrounded by people who operated beyond the reach of the law, people who held power and secrets that stretched like an underground web across the lives of unsuspecting others. Tendai's heart ached as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She described her slow descent into fear, the way Malik had tightened his grip on her, isolating her from her family, her friends, and eventually even herself. She had learned to live with his control, to navigate his moods, always fearful of saying or doing the wrong thing. Each word she spoke painted a clearer picture of the prison she had endured, a prison without walls, held together by his manipulative threats and the looming presence of those who supported him. There were moments when her voice faltered, her sentences breaking off into silence as she seemed to relive the trauma, staring into the pond as if it could offer her some kind of absolution. Tendai's hands clenched in his lap as he listened, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and helplessness. He had no words to ease the pain she carried, no way to change the events that had led her to this place. All he could do was bear witness to her suffering, to the strength it had taken to survive and escape. Zuri went on, speaking of the fear that had consumed her when she realized Malik would never let her go, that she was nothing more than a possession in his eyes, a pawn in his games of power and control. The realization had come slowly, but it had come with a clarity that terrified her. Tendai could see the pain in her face as she described the night she had made her choice to flee, to sever herself from that life and all its trappings, knowing the cost it would exact on her heart, on her sense of self, and on the love they had once shared. She spoke of the months after she left, the constant fear that had haunted her, the weight of guilt and regret pressing down on her every day. She had learned to live with the fear, to exist in a kind of half-life, always looking over her shoulder, always hiding in the shadows. Tendai's heart clenched as he listened, realizing the depth of her sacrifice, the strength it had taken to survive, to keep going despite the weight of her past. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the pond, and Zuri's voice grew softer, her words trailing off into the quiet that had settled around them. She seemed drained, as if every word had taken a part of her strength, leaving her vulnerable and exposed in a way that he had rarely seen. Tendai sat beside her in silence, absorbing the weight of her confession, feeling an ache that spread through his entire being. Without speaking, he reached out, placing a hand on hers, offering her a quiet, unspoken assurance. She didn't look at him, but her fingers curled around his, a silent acceptance of the comfort he offered. They sat together, their hands intertwined, the weight of her past settling between them like a shadow that would always linger, but one they could now face together. As the evening light began to fade, Zuri finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability that struck him to the core. There was no need for words, he could see everything in her eyes, the pain, the regret, the hope that had somehow survived despite everything. And in that moment, Tendai understood that her story, her suffering, was not something he could ever fully understand, but it was something he could hold with her, a burden they could carry together. The park grew still around them, the sounds of the world falling away, leaving only the quiet strength that flowed between them. Tendai held her gaze, his heart swelling with a determination he had not felt before. Whatever lay ahead, whatever shadows still lingered from her past, he knew that they would face it together. She was not alone, and for the first time he felt as if he had found his purpose, not to erase her pain, but to stand beside her, to be her anchor in the storm. As the last light of day faded, Tendai felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the peace of resolution or clarity, but the peace of understanding that some things could not be changed, only accepted. And in that acceptance he found a quiet strength, a willingness to face whatever challenges lay ahead, to walk through the shadows, not alone, but with her by his side. The wind off the ocean was sharp and bracing as Tendai and Zuri made their way across the rocky stretch of beach. The air held a salty chill that seeped through their clothes, but Zuri didn't seem to notice. She walked a few paces ahead, her gaze fixed on the waves rolling in, cresting and breaking against the shore in a rhythm as steady and relentless as time itself. Tendai followed quietly, watching her shoulders tense and relax with each breath, as if she were trying to draw strength from the sea. They'd come here on a whim, seeking some solace in the vastness of the water, a place where words and memories might be swallowed by the endless horizon. He could tell the journey through the park and the confessions they'd shared had left her drained, yet there was something resilient in her posture, something that refused to be broken even by the ghosts of her past. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape and making everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. For a moment it felt as if the sea and sky were holding their breath along with them. Kofi had stayed back with a trusted friend, giving them a rare moment alone. It was a decision made out of necessity, but Tendai had to admit he felt the need for this solitude, the quiet companionship of just him and Zuri against the backdrop of nature's vastness. He watched as she drew closer to the water, her steps slowing until she came to a stop a few meters from the edge, where the waves lapped softly against the sand. Tendai kept his distance, sensing that she needed this moment, something that was hers alone, free from judgment or expectation. As she stood there, her silhouette framed against the expanse of water, Tendai was struck by how small and fragile she seemed against the grandeur of the ocean. But as the minutes passed, he realized that this place suited her. The vastness mirrored the quiet strength she carried, a resilience forged in solitude, a spirit weathered by storms yet unyielding. He watched as her hair lifted in the wind, the dark curls wild and untamed, like waves crashing against unseen rocks. The sight filled him with an unexpected ache, a mixture of admiration and sadness that he couldn't fully explain. Tendai's gaze drifted to the sky, where clouds gathered, tinged with hues of violet and amber. The sea echoed the colors, its surface shimmering in the waning light. It was a beautiful scene, one he might have appreciated for its peacefulness under other circumstances. But there was something else in the air, something darker, a tension he couldn't quite place. He glanced back at Zuri, noting the slight rigidity in her stance, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. It was as if she sensed something too, a shadow looming just out of sight. Without warning, Tendai's instincts flared, a prickling sensation running down his spine. his gaze sharpened, scanning the beach and the cliffs that rose steeply from the shore. There was nothing, only the distant cry of seagulls and the hiss of the waves, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He looked back at Zuri, about to call her name, but then stopped, his attention snagged by a figure standing at the water's edge, some distance down the beach. The man was still, almost like a statue, his silhouette dark against the shifting colors of the sea. He was far enough away that Tendai couldn't make out his features, but something about his stance set off alarms in his mind. The stranger's posture was casual, almost too casual, as if he were merely admiring the view, but Tendai knew better. This was no random beachcomber. He felt a sudden chill, colder than the ocean breeze. As the man turned slightly, his gaze settling on them with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Tendai's breath caught as he watched the figure, his mind racing through the possibilities. The man seemed familiar, but not in any comforting way. There was something in his stance, his calculated stillness, that reminded Tendai of stories Yuri had told him, fragments of memories she had shared reluctantly, her voice filled with dread. He glanced at her, noticing the way she had stiffened, her gaze locked on the figure, her face draining of color. It was then that he realized this was no stranger. For a moment the beach seemed to dissolve around them, the wind and waves fading into a hollow silence. Tendai's heart pounded as he looked back at the man, feeling an anger rise in him that was as fierce as it was unexpected. He wanted to shield her from this, to take her away from the ghosts that refused to let her go. But Zuri remained motionless, her expression frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief. The man began to walk toward them, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Each step was deliberate, calculated, sending a shiver through Tendai. Zuri's hand gripped his arm, her fingers digging in with a desperation he hadn't felt from her before. Tendai glanced down at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability he had thought long buried. There was no mistaking it, she knew him, and whatever history lay between them, it was something dark, something that had left a mark too deep to erase. The stranger stopped a short distance from them, his expression inscrutable, though his gaze lingered on Zuri with a familiarity that made Tendai's skin crawl. He didn't move closer, but his presence was as oppressive as a storm cloud, filling the space between them with an unspoken threat. Tendai felt his muscles tense, his instincts screaming at him to protect her. But he held his ground, waiting, sensing that any wrong move could shatter the fragile tension that hung in the air. Zuri took a shaky breath beside him, her gaze never leaving the man. Tendai could see the memories flickering in her eyes, memories of a time she had fought to escape, memories that had clearly returned to haunt her. She looked as if she were facing down a nightmare made flesh, a phantom from her past that had risen from the shadows to confront her once more. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk, a gesture that held no warmth, only a cold, predatory amusement. It was as if he were savoring her fear, relishing the power he still held over her after all this time. Tendai's jaw clenched, anger flaring up within him. He had seen Zuri brave so much, had watched her rebuild herself from the ashes of her past. And now this man, a spectre she had believed gone, had returned to strip her of the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. He felt a surge of protectiveness rise in him, an urge to shield her from this intruder, to break the hold this man had over her. But something in Zuri's eyes stopped him, a silent plea for restraint, a reminder that this was her battle to face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The stranger's gaze shifted briefly to Tendai, and he felt the weight of the man's scrutiny, as if he were being assessed, measured, judged. But Tendai met his gaze without flinching, letting his own anger simmer just beneath the surface. He wanted the man to know that whatever hold he thought he had over Zuri, it would not go unchallenged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. He inclined his head slightly, a mocking gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say he had seen enough, that their silent standoff was of little consequence to him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps as unhurried as before, leaving them in stunned silence as his figure disappeared down the beach. Zuri exhaled a breath she had been holding, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her. Tendai remained close, his hand reaching for hers instinctively, offering her a steadying presence. He didn't speak, didn't press her for explanations. He knew that the encounter had been a reminder of all she had tried to leave behind, a painful resurgence of memories that would take time to process. They stood there for a long while, watching the man's silhouette grow smaller against the horizon until he was nothing more than a shadow, a distant memory fading into the twilight. Tendai felt his heart settle, the anger dissipating as he held Zuri close, grounding her in the present, in the safety of his presence. The waves continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to the turmoil that had swept through the beach, as if offering a reminder that time moved on, regardless of the shadows that lingered. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Tendai felt a quiet determination settle within him. He knew that this man, this stranger from her past, would not fade away so easily, that his presence was a harbinger of challenges yet to come. But he also knew, with a certainty as steady as the sea itself, that he would stand by her side, that he would not let her face this darkness alone. The cliffside was raw and desolate, the wind whipping around Tendai and Zuri with a fierce, unrelenting force. It felt like the edge of the world, the rugged landscape a stark contrast to the softness of the beach they'd just left behind. Here nature was brutal. Untamed rocks jutted out like sharp teeth over the churning waves far below, and the sky hung heavy, bruised with the promise of an oncoming storm. There was something fitting about this place, as if the elements themselves were reflecting the turmoil that Zuri carried inside her. They walked in silence along the cliff's edge, the ground uneven beneath their feet, small stones scattering and tumbling down into the abyss below with each step. Tendai kept a careful distance, allowing her the space she seemed to need, though he remained close enough to steady her if she faltered. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a haze of muted greys and deep blues. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, yet he could feel the weight of the secrets she held, pressing down on her with every step. Finally, they stopped at a narrow outcropping, a natural ledge where they could look out over the endless expanse of water. The wind howled around them, pulling at Zuri's hair and clothes, as if trying to strip away the barriers she had built around herself. Tendai stayed silent, sensing that she was on the brink of something, that she had brought him here not just to see the view but to confront the truth she had hidden for so long. She stood at the edge of the ledge, her arms wrapped around herself, eyes locked on the waves crashing below. There was something haunting about her posture, a vulnerability he had rarely seen. She looked as if she were balancing on the edge of a precipice, caught between holding on to her secrets and letting them fall into the depths, freeing herself from their grip. Tendai's heart ached as he watched her, wanting to reach out to steady her, yet knowing that this was a moment she needed to face alone. Zuri's gaze remained fixed on the water, her face shadowed with memories that seemed as endless as the sea. The wind drowned out all other sounds, isolating them in a cocoon of silence, broken only by the crash of the waves. Her hands clenched at her sides, and he noticed the faint trembling in her fingers, a sign of the internal battle she was fighting. She seemed smaller here, fragile in a way he hadn't fully understood before, and yet there was a strength in her stance, an unbreakable resolve that spoke of all the years she had survived, even when the world had offered her little but darkness. After what felt like an eternity, Zuri closed her eyes, her face softening, as if she was surrendering to the weight of her past. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and Tendai could almost feel the release, the silent relinquishment of the burden she had carried alone for so long. She seemed to draw strength from the wind, allowing it to strip away the layers of fear and shame, exposing the raw truth beneath. Tendai's breath hitched as he realized how much she must have endured in silence, how deeply those secrets had scarred her. And then, in that quiet, windswept moment, Zuri turned her face to him, her eyes glistening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was as if she were offering him a glimpse into the hidden parts of herself, the fragments of a life she had kept locked away. There was no need for words, he could see the pain and the resilience in her gaze, the strength it had taken to stand here, to trust him with the broken pieces of her past. Without a word, Tendai stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand in his. She didn't pull away, instead, she let him hold her, her fingers intertwining with his, as if seeking an anchor. They stood together on the edge of the cliff, grounded by each other's presence, the silence between them no longer heavy with secrets but filled with a quiet understanding. The wind whipped around them, fierce and unyielding, yet in that moment they were steady, bound by the unspoken promise of healing and the fragile hope of a future free from shadows. The countryside stretched out before them like a forgotten corner of paradise, untouched and untroubled by the complexities of the lives they'd left behind. Tendai guided the car down a narrow dirt road, flanked by wildflowers and rolling hills, the golden hues of late afternoon casting everything in a soft, almost ethereal light. Zuri sat quietly beside him, her gaze drifting over the landscape, a mixture of weariness and longing etched into her features. She looked almost peaceful here, as if the vastness of the countryside offered her a momentary escape from the shadows that had pursued her for so long. They arrived at a small, secluded cottage nestled near a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by a thick ring of trees that offered both shelter and privacy. Tendai watched as Zuri stepped out of the car, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. There was something childlike in her expression, a glimpse of the girl she might have been, unburdened and free. He felt a surge of relief seeing her like this, a brief reprieve from the weight that had been crushing her since her return. Inside, the cottage was simple yet warm, filled with the scents of cedarwood and old leather, the furniture worn but welcoming. The walls were adorned with landscape paintings and family portraits, as if to remind its occupants of the generations who had found solace within its walls. Tendai watched as Zuri ran her fingers over the rough-hewn wooden table, her eyes softening as if she could feel the history embedded in every corner. It was a place untouched by her past, free of the memories that had haunted her. Here she could exist in the present, if only for a little while. As evening settled in, they sat by the lake, a small fire crackling between them, casting a warm glow that reflected off the water's still surface. Tendai looked over at her, catching a rare moment of ease in her expression as she gazed at the fire, her face illuminated by its flickering light. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the scent of wild grasses and distant wood smoke, grounding them in the simplicity of this place. For the first time he saw her relax, the usual tension in her shoulders melting away, her hands resting loosely in her lap. But as the silence deepened, Tendai sensed a shift in her demeanor. She grew quiet, almost withdrawn, her gaze turning from the fire to the stars just beginning to emerge in the twilight sky. Her face held an intensity that hadn't been there before, as if she were weighing something in her mind, a decision that pressed upon her with an undeniable urgency. He didn't press her, he knew by now that her revelations came in waves, each one carrying its own weight, demanding patience and understanding. After a long pause, Zuri exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool night air. She looked at him, her expression unguarded in a way he had rarely seen, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and a newfound resolve. There was a sadness there, a shadow that ran deeper than he'd realized, and as she looked away, back at the lake, he felt his heart clench with the understanding that something profound was coming. With her gaze fixed on the water, she began to speak, her voice low and steady, each word careful, as if she were unraveling a tightly bound thread. She spoke of a truth she had buried deeply, something she had kept hidden even from herself. There was no anger in her tone, only a resigned acceptance, a weariness that spoke of years spent wrestling with a part of herself she had tried to forget. Tendai listened, his mind racing to absorb the weight of her confession. She spoke of a time when her desperation had led her to consider paths she never would have imagined. During the darkest days with Malik, she had been pushed to her limits, manipulated into believing she was capable of the same darkness he harbored. There had been a night she had barely allowed herself to remember, when she had almost crossed a line, almost given in to the shadows he had cast over her. It was a moment she had fled from, yet one that still haunted her, a memory that lingered in the quiet spaces of her mind. Her voice shook as she recounted that night, the memory raw and painful, a wound that had never fully healed. She had looked in the mirror and seen someone she didn't recognize, someone tainted by Malik's influence. It was that realization, that brush with darkness, that had driven her to leave, to reclaim herself before it was too late. But even after her escape, the memory had followed her, a ghost that lingered in every quiet moment, reminding her of how close she had come to losing herself completely. Tendai felt the gravity of her words settle over him like a storm cloud, a mixture of sorrow and compassion swelling within him. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly, offering her the warmth of his presence. She didn't pull away. Instead, she clung to him, her fingers cold, her grip as desperate as the confession she had shared. As they sat there, surrounded by the silence of the countryside, Tendai felt a new understanding dawn within him. He saw, in her struggle, a woman who had fought her way back from the brink, who had clawed her way out of the shadows to stand here, beside him, bruised but unbroken. There was a fierce beauty in her resilience, a strength she hadn't even realized she possessed, and in that moment he felt his own resolve strengthen. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows over their faces, and he held her gaze, his expression unwavering. She had revealed to him her darkest secret, and in return he offered her the quiet promise of acceptance, a vow to carry this burden with her, to shield her from the echoes of a past she could not fully escape. They sat there, hands intertwined, the vastness of the night stretching around them like a protective shroud. In the silence that followed, Tendai knew that this revelation, this moment of raw honesty, was not just a confession, it was a step toward healing, a chance to rewrite the future they both yearned for. And as the stars emerged, bright and clear above them, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative light guiding them both through the darkness. The tension was palpable as Tendai and Zuri walked toward the edge of the quiet town square, where the dim streetlights cast long shadows across the cobblestones. The air felt thick, electric, charged with the weight of everything left unspoken, everything that had brought them to this moment. Tendai's pulse raced, though he kept his steps steady, his gaze fixed on the figure waiting for them beneath the glow of a single streetlight. Jonah stood with his back to them, his stance casual, hands tucked into his coat pockets as though he were merely out for an evening stroll. But Tendai recognized the deliberate nature of his posture, a subtle message of power, control. Jonah turned slowly as they approached, his face illuminated by the streetlight's cold glow, revealing a faint, knowing smile that barely touched his eyes. Tendai could feel Zuri tense beside him, her presence a tight, silent energy bracing against the storm of memories that Jonah's presence had stirred. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Tendai felt his anger simmering, tempered only by his need to stay steady for Zuri. Jonah's gaze flicked over them both, lingering on Zuri with a familiarity that made Tendai's skin crawl. There was no warmth, no familial bond, only a possessive, calculating coldness that marked him as a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Jonah's presence was a stark reminder of Malik, of the world Zuri had clawed her way out of, a world that refused to let her go. Standing there facing him, Tendai understood the lengths this man would go to, the quiet threats hidden behind his smooth exterior. Jonah radiated a quiet menace, an assurance that he held all the power here, and the awareness of that control flickered in his gaze like a spark waiting to ignite. As the silence stretched on, Tendai felt Zuri shift beside him, her hand brushing his ever so slightly, a silent gesture that grounded them both, a reminder of why they were here, of what they had chosen to stand for. She lifted her chin, meeting Jonah's gaze with a defiance that surprised even Tendai, a strength that had been forged from the scars of her past. There was no need for words, he could see it in her eyes. A fierce determination that refused to bow to the shadows this man represented. Jonah's smile faded, replaced by a look of faint irritation, as if Zuri's defiance was an inconvenience, a crack in his carefully constructed plans. His gaze hardened, his mouth curling in contempt as he regarded her, a silent rebuke that sent a chill through Tendai. But Zuri held her ground, her expression unyielding, even as he took a single step toward them, closing the distance with a calculated ease. In that moment, Tendai felt the quiet fury rise within him, a protective instinct that was as fierce as it was unshakable. Jonah may have held power, influence, and connections, but Tendai held something more: the unwavering commitment to protect Zuri, to fight for the life they had struggled to reclaim. He knew that Jonah could see it too, could sense the intensity that lay just beneath the surface, and for a brief second, Tendai saw a flicker of something else in the man's eyes: uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of fear. Jonah straightened, his face a mask of cold disdain as he delivered his ultimatum, his voice low, controlled, each word laced with an unspoken threat. He claimed that Zuri's son Kofi belonged to the family legacy, that he had a right to shape the boy into Malik's image. Tendai felt a surge of anger, a primal protectiveness that clenched his fists, but he forced himself to stay calm, sensing that any show of rage would only feed Jonah's arrogance. Zuri stood tall, her eyes flashing with a determination that left no room for doubt. Tendai saw the decision in her expression, a resolve that seemed to burn brighter than the shadows that Jonah cast. It was as if in this moment she had finally chosen to let go of the fear, to confront the remnants of her past with the courage that he had always known lay within her. Jonah's face twisted into a sneer, as if disgusted by their audacity, as if the very notion of defiance was laughable. He took a step back, his gaze dark and contemptuous, his stance conveying a promise of retaliation, a vow that this confrontation was far from over. But Tendai could see that his power was beginning to wane, that Zuri's strength had unnerved him in a way he hadn't expected. Jonah's threats hung in the air, empty in the face of the quiet, unbreakable bond that Tendai and Zuri had forged. Without a word, Jonah turned on his heel, his retreat as silent and calculating as his arrival. Tendai watched as his silhouette disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving them alone in the square. The tension broke, and Tendai felt a wave of relief flood over him, though the heaviness of the encounter still lingered, a dark residue clinging to the edges of his thoughts. Zuri exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing as the reality of Jonah's departure settled over her. Tendai reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, a silent assurance that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. She looked at him, her expression softened by a gratitude he could feel in every fibre of his being, a quiet understanding that their bond had become unbreakable in the face of everything they had endured. As they stood in the stillness of the town square, Tendai knew that this moment marked a turning point, a choice for freedom that they had both made, a commitment to a future untethered from the shadows of her past. The night felt lighter somehow, the air clear and fresh, as if the world itself had acknowledged the end of a long, bitter chapter. In that space of silence he felt the beginnings of peace settle within him, a fragile yet unmistakable sense that they had, at last, chosen a path that led not into the darkness but toward the light.